Good evening. Goeienaand, Dumelang, Sanbonani, Molweni. Welcome to this Vice-Chancellor's Open Lecture, which the University of Cape Town is delivering online. We have people from around the world joining us this evening. I want to give a special acknowledgement to those who have studied or worked with, or perhaps with UCT or with Cambridge University. Tonight's lecture will take the form of a lecture followed by a discussion. It's an unusual form, but we thought we should do that with Professor Toope. The lecture addresses a question that has become more prominent as COVID-19 has forced many institutions around the world to go into lockdown. That question centers around the value of higher education and the future of universities. In the USA, commentators suggest that the primary reason students take on a heavy debt burden to earn an expensive university degree is to get a job. In July, Google challenged that reasoning when it announced its own series of professional courses where graduates could earn a Google Career Certificate for training to enter specific high-paying jobs that are in high demand. While preparing for a career is certainly a good reason for individuals to invest time and tuition to earn an extra degree, universities also play a much wider role in a way that builds up our society and helps us to develop our ways of thinking, our ways of being, and our ways of doing, whether in a job or in our wider lives. Universities must aspire to be places of ideas, places of debate and knowledge. In the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence will take over many tasks, but only humans can understand other humans. We need to develop the skills that will help steer the fourth industrial revolution in ways that will build and benefit society. The kinds of issues universities are seeking to understand and resolve in this century are global. Climate change, urbanization, gender-based violence, xenophobia and racism, sustainable transport and energy, water shortages, a range of health issues such as COVID-19, HIV/AIDS, malaria, cancer, technology issues that are arising with the fourth industrial revolution. These are just a few of the problems humanity is wrestling with. To deal with issues of such magnitude and their effects across different communities and environments, we cannot work as individuals or even as teams within an individual university. One of the lessons COVID-19 has brought home is that we need to work together across the planet to solve these planet-sized problems. Otherwise, we will not be able to solve them. So UCT researchers work with colleagues around the world, including the University of Cambridge. Our collaborations with Cambridge include groundbreaking work in physics and astronomy, in engineering, science and technology, and health sciences, among others. Cambridge alumni come to UCT for postgraduate and postdoctoral work and vice versa. UCT also has a strong relationship with Cambridge through our mutual membership in groups such as the International Alliance of Research Universities, IARU, a network of 11 international research-intensive universities from 9 countries across the globe. And through IARU and other meetings that I've had the privilege of getting to know Professor Stephen Toope, the Vice-Chancellor of University of Cambridge. We have found that we share a common view of the value and purpose of higher education to help build and heal society. Professor Toope's academic interests are in international law, and human rights, international legal theory, and international development. His distinguished career includes being an observer on the UN's mission to the first post-apartheid South African general elections in 1994, and chairing the UN's working group on enforced and involuntary disappearances. In 2005, he was a fact finder for the Commission of Inquiry into the actions of Canadian government officials in relation to the Meha Ara, a Canadian subjected to rendition from the USA to Syria. Professor Toope was born and raised in Montreal, Canada. He studied history and literature at Harvard University, graduating magna cum laude, before earning degrees in common law and civil law at McGill University. He completed a PhD at Trinity College, Cambridge, and his 1986 thesis, Arbitrations Involving States and Foreign Private Parties, a study in contemporary legal process, is available via open access, along with those of thousands of other Cambridge alumni, including the late Professor Stephen Hawking. Professor Toope's distinguished career includes directing the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, leading the University of British Columbia, and serving as president of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation and as Dean of Law at McGill University. From 1986 to 1987, he served as law clerk to Brian Dixon, who was Chief Justice of Canada. And in 1991, he was research director at the Office of the Special Representative concerning the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Professor Toope subsequently worked as a consultant to Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, the Canadian International Development Agency, and a number of United Nations agencies. Among the distinctions he has received are the Queen Elizabeth II Silver Jubilee Medal in 2012, the United Way of Canada President's Award of Distinction in 2014, various honorary degrees, and the John Reed Medal of the Canadian Council of International Law in 2015. Also in 2015, in recognition of his service and accomplishment, he was inducted as an Officer of the Order of Canada, one of Canada's highest honors. When I first discussed with Professor Toope the possibility of delivering this VC's open lecture, the plan was to welcome him physically here on our campus, and we still hope that will happen someday soon. Meanwhile, UCT is honored to offer him this virtual podium where he can speak not only to the UCT community, but to people around the world who have logged on. Professor Toope, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for agreeing to do this lecture virtually. Welcome to Virtual UCT. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pakeng, and friends in Cape Town, friends all around the globe, thank you for joining us this evening. I really do wish that I was with you in person in Cape Town, and I do hope that one of these days it will happen. But for reasons that we're all aware of, it was not possible right now, and I'm still delighted to be able to speak with you, even if it's remotely. It's really been one of the great pleasures of my job to interact quite often and fruitfully with Professor Pakeng at meetings of university groups like the International Alliance of Research Universities. Earlier today, we had a chance to speak one-to-one and exchange some impressions on what the past few months have been like for each of us. As fellow vice-chancellors, we perform quite similar jobs and we face similar challenges, albeit in very different settings. I feel that there's always much to learn from her experience at the head of UCT and from UCT colleagues. I've been asked to share a few thoughts on what it means for universities like ours to take on a role of global leadership and how they're able to achieve that through global partnerships. I'm interested in hearing your perspectives, and I welcome your comments and questions later on. Well, as you all know, so much has changed and so quickly over the last few months. Yet, reflecting on what I might have said if I'd been with you in Cape Town in April as we planned, I suspect that it wouldn't be terribly different from what I'm going to say today. If anything, there's added urgency now. I'll return to the current crisis later. Let me start by asking first what we're talking about when we speak about leadership. There's a particular version of leadership that I subscribe to and aspire to. It's usually described as the philosophy of servant leadership. And the premise is that the main goal of a leader is to serve. It's usually applied to individuals, but can rightly, I think, be extended to an organization like a university. This tells us that leadership is never an objective in itself. We serve because we're leaders, and we're leaders because we serve. Well, how does that apply to our own universities? Look at our mission statements. The mission statement of the University of Cambridge is as follows: to contribute to society through the pursuit of education, learning, and research at the highest international levels of excellence. Before anything else, literally, come the words, to contribute to society. Now, UCT's mission statement talks about scholarship and research having, and I quote, a positive impact on our society and our environment, end quotes. So, who do we serve? First and foremost, as institutions, we serve our societies, and we do that in a number of ways. To begin with, we serve our local communities, for instance, by creating local jobs or contributing to local infrastructure, helping to improve the capacity of local small and medium businesses. Then we serve our society at a national level as well. And whether it's in South Africa or the United Kingdom, much is expected of us. For example, we're expected to deliver the discoveries that will fuel our country's development. We're expected to nurture the academic, professional, business, and civic leadership that our countries need. We're expected to nurture the entrepreneurial and inquisitive mindsets that will transform our countries in the decades ahead through our graduating students. Contributing to society at the national level means engaging with national conversations that have repercussions outside our own labs, libraries, and lecture halls. For instance, how do we ensure that our universities are truly representative of and welcoming to the wide range of talent that exists in our societies across all boundaries of race, class, sexual orientation, social status, and so on? How do we best engage with and learn from complex and uncomfortable histories? And here we can draw a direct line between questions about decolonization being raised at UCT and questions now being raised in Cambridge around legacies of slavery and continuing patterns of racism in British society. Our institution's response to these and other issues will set the standard for how our wider societies respond to them as well. We must lead by example. So yes, we serve our societies at the local and the national level, but we also serve society in a much more comprehensive global sense. As the Vice-Chancellor mentioned at the outset, the greatest challenges we face are global. Take poverty. According to some estimates, at least 10% of the world's population, over 700 million people, live in extreme poverty. This number looks set to increase due to the COVID crisis, which has had a disproportionate impact on the poor. And what about climate change, mass migration, unequal access to healthcare and education, global food security, the development and management of new technologies? What about chronic disease? And what about those neglected diseases affecting over 1 billion people around the world and costing developing economies billions every year? Now, these are only the most obvious among many challenges where we're seeking pragmatic solutions. And as we've seen, no institution, no country, no matter how seemingly isolated, is immune to events occurring somewhere else on the planet. The society we serve is no longer limited to our immediate communities or even to our countries. Whether it's understanding the molecular basis of Alzheimer's, or helping farmers to increase their crop yields, or trying to develop accurate diagnostic tests or vaccines for COVID. What we do in universities like Cambridge and UCT affects lives and livelihoods the world over. And the people we educate are likely to become leaders of government, of civil society, of academia, and of industry. That's what I mean by contributing to society. It is in this broadest sense that I understand service. And that's the kind of leadership that I believe universities should aspire to. Our service to society is not only the right aspiration to have, it's also, I believe, the basis of the social contract that allows us to operate. This is especially true of universities like UCT and Cambridge that are publicly funded. We're supported by governments because we contribute to society. And the public trust in us is directly linked to the fact that we do in education and research everything that is oriented to the benefit of society. That public trust has to be earned. And these days, universities like ours have to try much harder, I think, harder than ever, to earn and retain public trust. We do that by reaffirming that society's goals are our own, by widening access and enhancing levels of participation, by delivering research and helping to foster innovation that will drive inclusive social and economic progress, by being open about what we do and about how we do it. There's another way in which we gain public trust. Universities, and research-intensive universities in particular, are perhaps the only modern institution with the means and the legitimacy to bridge the gaps between disciplines, between different sectors of society, and between different cultures. We have a convening power unlike anyone else's because we're seen at our best as neutral spaces without self-serving agendas. We're uniquely placed to bring together policymakers, non-governmental and international organizations, businesses, and the wider knowledge community to explore solutions to real problems in the world. This legitimacy, I hope, allows us to lead in efforts to improve lives, not just at our doorstep, but wherever in the world that improvement is needed. But like our reputations, this public trust, public goodwill, is hard to win and sadly easy to squander. If our societies don't believe that our priority is serving them, if societies come to believe that universities are self-serving and internally focused, we must address that perception and do a much better job at engaging with the wider community. Now, this is not just about projection outwards, better communicating the import and impact of our work. First, we have to listen better, to understand the needs and aspirations of our societies and connect with them. Communication is not selling, it's a two-way street. I've said in the past that knowledge-centered institutions like ours are going through a particularly difficult time. I've frequently expressed dismay at a growing sense that our legitimacy as society's honest brokers is being challenged, at the ever more common narrative that universities' goals and our society's goals no longer match. In an atmosphere of increasing regulation and decreasing resources, what worries me most is the widespread erosion of trust. The past few years haven't been easy for institutions like ours, whose aim is to create, curate, and communicate knowledge. This is certainly true in the UK, but the more I talk with fellow VCs all around the world, the more obvious it is that this problem exists elsewhere. Now, we could spend the whole day talking about what's caused the erosion of trust. There is, in general, less deference to authority, whether of governments, of places like universities, often considered as part of the system. Technology has not only increased the speed of communication, but has also allowed a proliferation of views to emerge and coexist, a hugely positive development, but one that certainly challenges long-held understandings of reliable sources of knowledge and insight. And there are real legitimate grievances from social groups that have been marginalized and whose voices are finally cutting through. But in the UK and in the US and elsewhere in the world, there have also been spurious and politically motivated attempts to undermine trust in knowledge and in knowledge-based institutions. This sentiment was more or less encapsulated in the now infamous observation made back in 2016 by a British Minister of State, no less, that people, quotes, have had enough of experts, end quotes. Public distrust of institutions of learning is not a new thing, but around the time when I first became Vice-Chancellor, it seemed to me to be reaching new heights, and it permeated public discourse in all sorts of insidious ways. Fast forward to today, and what do you know? Well, it turns out that COVID has taught us that we do need experts, people who seek to understand complex problems and search for pragmatic solutions. Post-COVID, there is a great public acknowledgement of this fact. We need scientists who can explain the genetics of this new virus, who can understand its patterns of transmission, who can develop trustworthy diagnostic tests, who can develop vaccines, who can carry out medical trials at the required scale and with the required rigor. But we also need mathematicians who can model the infection. We need engineers who can help scale up the logistics in medical supply chains, who can invent efficient and cheaper ventilators. We need social psychologists who can help us understand why people behave as they do. For instance, why do some people refuse to wear face coverings and why are others compliant? We need geographers and the sociologists to explain how the disease affects different populations. We need economists to help us understand the immediate and potential long-term economic impact of the pandemic. We need educators to ensure that students are not disadvantaged by the inevitable changes in the way they're schooled. And we need writers and filmmakers and musicians to help us process our experiences and build personal and social resilience. These are all experts, and we need them all, just like we need the experts in crop science who will make future crops drought or pest resistant. Just like we need the experts who will develop new treatments for cancer or neurodegenerative diseases. Just like we need the experts who will help us tackle or reverse the effects of climate change and decarbonize our societies. Expertise and knowledge matter more than ever before. And the nurturing of expertise and knowledge is exactly what universities are good at. It's often remarked that crises don't really change leaders, but reveal them. I think the same is true about organizations or governments, even of societies. A crisis reveals strengths and exposes weaknesses. And the past 6 months have shown why universities like Cambridge and UCT are more necessary than ever. Since March, Cambridge has undertaken almost 200 different research projects on coronavirus transmission, diagnostic testing, vaccine development, social behavior, on our health services capacity, on public health responses to the pandemic, on the educational impact of COVID, and on the post-COVID recovery trajectory. An entire university department focused on infectious disease has pivoted its research to better address the immediate and long-term impact of COVID. But the crisis has also revealed some of our real constraints and limitations. Perhaps the one that's worried me most is the way that the pandemic has emphasized and made more acute some of the seemingly baked-in inequalities in our higher education system. Over the past few years, we've invested a lot of effort into widening access and participation to our university life. We want our admissions process to be open to talented and tenacious students from all backgrounds. But the disruption to education and exams at the end of the past academic year meant that students who were already at a disadvantage were once again being let down, left behind, because outside of school, they didn't have access to the tutoring, the technology, or even the physical space at home to continue their studies. Confusion over the school grades given to students in the absence of exams in the UK meant that once again, students from backgrounds not typically represented in universities were marginalized. Despite the chaos caused by rapid and unpredictable changes in government policy, and it was chaos, Cambridge admitted its most diverse cohort of students ever for this new academic year, with the largest ever cohort from state schools and the highest proportion ever of students from areas of low participation. But we remain keenly alert to the risk that the ongoing public health emergency poses to many students' prospects of entering university. I mentioned a moment ago some of the research projects and initiatives that Cambridge has undertaken in response to the pandemic. This important work has underlined a stark truth, not just for Cambridge, but for all research-intensive organizations tackling a global challenge. As the Vice-Chancellor said in her introduction, we simply can't do it alone. There's nothing like a global pandemic to reveal just how intricately and profoundly connected we are. I've spent years talking about the need for collaboration amongst universities, and I've done it from a place of absolute conviction. But the past few months have revealed the urgency in this need. COVID is an inescapable reality, no matter whether we're in Cambridge or in Cape Town. No matter how good it is, no matter how well established, an individual research and teaching organization cannot respond on its own. In a world of constrained resources and with challenges increasing in both complexity and scale, collaboration is imperative. The lone researcher, even the lone institution, is no longer a viable model for the delivery of world-leading contributions. Finding the solution to any of the great global problems will depend on our institution's ability to harness the power of strategic partnerships. In fulfilling our ambition to serve society, we rely on continued and expanded collaboration with our partners. These partnerships help us reiterate that our purpose is to contribute to society, and in doing so, I hope, they help us cultivate and maintain the public trust and allow us to deliver excellence to an international standard. Now, the good news is that we have more tools at our disposal than ever before to facilitate these interactions. I was hugely impressed by some of our Cambridge engineers who, early on in the pandemic, leapt into action to design an open source, inexpensive ventilator in partnership with Cambridge clinicians and with South African manufacturers to treat COVID-19 patients in low-income countries. Most of you will know about the domestic goods company, DeFi, which partnered with our Department of Engineering. I'm also pleased to note existing collaborations between Cambridge and UCT colleagues in other areas, including global health, cancer diagnostics, energy transition, human-wildlife cooperation, urban environments and water distribution, and the domestic underpinnings of peaceful and democratic societies, to name but a few. Now, some of these projects involve only a few people, while others are much larger in scale. But each of them is contributing to knowledge about our world. Often, by contributing to a better understanding of the particular locations in which they're taking place, bringing the local and the global together. By linking the intellectual and the human resources of our institutions and applying them to real problems faced by real people, we contribute to our societies locally, nationally, and globally. And that, as I've argued earlier, is exactly what we're here to do. Once again, my sincere thanks to Professor Pakeng for inviting me to speak to the UCT community and others today, and my thanks to all of you for joining me. I eagerly anticipate the day when I can join you in person again. Cape Town is actually one of my favorite places on earth. I look forward to hearing your questions or remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Toope. Thank you for the inspiring lecture. We're going to have a conversation now. I mean, I heard you mention in your lecture how collaboration across disciplines builds and strengthens higher education social contract with society. Yet what we're seeing around the world today, especially in national and global politics, is not the will to collaborate, but rather to polarize opinions and attitudes. How can universities help turn that around? I mean, can we? If we can, how?
I think it is yet another one of the great challenges of our time. We do seem to be living through a period where far from trying to bring together people, many political leaders and others seek to find ways to separate them, to segment, to target communications. I do think that universities have an amazing role to play here, both in terms of our own student bodies and ensuring that we're bringing together a really exciting and vibrant mix of students who come from all of these different backgrounds and providing a shape for them and help in navigating differences of opinion. It's not something that just happens easily, and I actually think we're living through a period where a lot of younger people are finding it harder to navigate those differences of opinions. There's a sense in which people are easily drawn to a sense of anger in conversation. And I think the more that we can help both our students and ourselves contribute to conversations that accept that there are differences of opinion and try to empathize as opposed to simply convince people about our own values, the better off we are. And I think really universities are one of the best places on earth to do that. But I do think, and I'll stop here, we have a broader role too, as you're suggesting, outside in the wider community. And that, I suppose, is to provide both as much knowledge and information to people as we can so that they have the resources intellectually to draw their own conclusions, but also to help shape public discourse. And, you know, our professors, many of them are out in the public sphere trying to help people understand the complexity of the world around us. And I think that's a hugely important role, and we should be supportive of that. In fact, I think one of the challenges we often face in universities is that historically that's been seen as completely an add-on, not something truly valued by university administrations, by heads of department, etc., by processes of tenure and promotion. So I think we've got to think that through and challenge ourselves around the importance of that role.
That's interesting you say that. I mean, it's you're talking about thought leadership, but it seems to me that the voice, the knowledgeable voice of the university in that space is now competing with the voice of sometimes not so well informed, that's so prevalent on social media, and it reaches much wider. So that creates a complexity in terms of how do you provide, and even how do you create a sense that debate or being scholarly is not always about just winning the argument.
Right.
What does engagement mean? So when you see someone putting something out in social media, what's your initial response? That what would be a scholarly response to that? And normally I find that young people just go into it and either believe without asking, like the sense of curiosity is sort of gone. People just get into it and perpetuate the mistruth sometimes.
Well, it's a great observation, and I think that one of the challenges is holding true to what it is that the university can contribute. So I don't think that our highest best purpose is served by simply putting out 140 or 280 characters on a particular issue, quite frankly. I'm not saying people shouldn't do that, but I don't know that it speaks to the highest best purpose of the university. I think what we need to do first and foremost is hold on to the idea that actually trying to understand something is important. And we have to try then to convince people that that's worth the effort. And so I think part of the public discourse then has to be, how do we help people gain access to somewhat more informed opinions and give themselves the moment to process it and think about it. And I think we have to model that. So I think to the extent that we just descend into the Twitter sphere and respond immediately on issues, in some senses, we're undermining our own purpose. But having said all of that, to your point, the reality of social media is there, and we can't afford to completely disengage. So I'm not suggesting that we stay removed from it. I just think we have to find ways of modeling social media engagement that is about trying to help people understand and not simply just getting into an argument that is finger pointing, because I don't think that actually advances the purpose of the university or of the academic. I'll say finally that I think this is going to be one of the great challenges for colleagues over the next while. We have to help our colleagues understand your point, which is that simply having the data does not win the argument, and simply putting it out is not enough. If it ever was, I don't think it ever was, and it certainly isn't now in an era of social media. So we have to find ways of presenting our arguments in understandable fashion, and actually understanding that we've got to engage in that process and not just throw things at people and say, look, here's what we know about climate change. We know you have to stop doing this. Stop it. I mean, that just isn't good enough. We've got to help people work it through.
Yeah. I see there's a question from the audience, and it says, one significant measure of society, of a society, nation state can be found in the quality of their respective education institutions. Is a society tolerant is a society embedded with strong, independent, ethical, professional institutions of learning, not fearful in speaking truth to power? How can this ethos of constant openness to critical creative learning be fostered in societies deficient in such an ideal normative?
Well, let me say first off, I agree with the presumption in the question. There is no doubt in my mind that societies that have healthy, vibrant, independent universities are likely to be healthier societies. Other aspects as well. The university is not alone in that. Independent media is also important, and obviously other forms of political institutions are important. But there was a study done probably now 15 years ago that came out of Harvard and was done in collaboration with the EU. And it was very interesting because it actually assessed what were the primary indicators. We're not causality here, but indicators of healthy societies, and one of them, and successful universities, and one of them was independence of the university sector from the state. And that doesn't mean that they have to be private. In fact, that has nothing to do with it. Even public institutions have to be given a sense of autonomy. So how do you go about doing that? Again, this is an argument that has to be won. I made, I hope, a case for our desire to contribute to society and to earn public trust. And I think the inverse of that is that we have to demand of society that if we earn that trust, that we must be granted autonomy. And those are things that actually have to go hand in hand and ratchet each other up in many ways. Because if our only purpose is to serve some short-term governmental policy, then I think, frankly, we've lost the game. Because governmental policies shift, priorities shift. I'm not saying we should be disconnected from them, but we can't be utterly subservient to them either. And we have, in the great history of institutions that are universities, hundreds of years of experience of how we contribute through teaching and education broadly and research to the service of our society. But it's the education and research piece that is our contribution, and to do that effectively, we have to be autonomous.
But aren't we too optimistic when we expect society to understand the practice of science? I mean, we want public trust, and we do research that's relevant to society. But there's a practice of science, and I found that during COVID, during the pandemic, many people in society have asked questions. Wow, you guys seem not to agree. You don't even, you keep fighting. We are wasting money. You keep fighting. We have a pandemic to deal with. And then I say to them, but this is how ideas grow. This is the practice of science. We engage, and this contestation is part of the growth of knowledge. It's not, it doesn't mean it's a waste of resources. And I thought, you know, it's as much as we talked about the return of science with the pandemic, there's also a need, it seems to me, for society to understand the practice of science, that it's not evangelism. It's not as if you say something, a scientist says something, everyone agrees and just follows. Asking questions, interrogating, and maybe an alternative view, maybe another way of approaching, another gaze into the problem. That's what makes, that's the part of the practice of science. And society doesn't necessarily understand. They think it's a waste of time and money. So I think that earning public trust is going to need also for us to educate society about that.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it was very interesting that governments, some governments at the beginning of this crisis, in a sense, I would argue, hid behind science by making the case that they were just following the science, quotes, following the science, not understanding or admitting that we were learning as we were going along. And in fact, there was no single set of answers about how to deal with COVID, how to treat COVID, how to prevent COVID, how to prevent transmission. We're learning every day more about this. And so I think you're right. And the risk, of course, with governments saying we follow the science is when it becomes apparent that there are complexities and we may have got some of the initial responses wrong, that they'll turn and start criticizing and saying, well, science has nothing to offer. And of course, neither of those views is right. Science doesn't have all the answers immediately, nor does it have nothing to offer. It is, as you say, iterative, it's contestation that is absolutely crucial there. We have a unit at Cambridge, which I really find exciting, called the Center for Science and Policy. And it's actually really designed to try to address these kinds of issues. How do we help wider communities, policymakers understand how not just science, but all forms of research actually work? I think you're right. We have a role in helping the wider community understand that. It's tough because it's a complicated set of processes, but if we're going to continue to earn public trust, part of our job is to help people understand it better.
Yeah. There's Peter Hewson on the question line is asking us both a question. I'm thinking this is Peter Hewson from University of Wisconsin-Madison. I don't know, Professor Peter Hewson, I don't know. But I'll read the question because it's interesting. It's talking to some of the issues you raised. And he says, Cambridge and UCT, splendid as they are both institutions that are rooted in Western intellectual traditions. how should they reach out to and include other intellectual traditions that in many ways are marginalized? And in a way, talking to the issue that you raised about, calls for decolonization. Do you want to take that on, Professor Stephen?
Well, I'll start, but I want to hear your thoughts as well. Look, I think the premise is correct. We are rooted in Western traditions, and look, I'm proud of those traditions. I don't want to denigrate the traditions of thought and challenge and the scientific tradition, which is partly Western based, not exclusively. I think those are all things that we want to hold on to, but I think there is no doubt that we need to open up our curriculum to be more inclusive, open up our areas of expertise and challenge ourselves to read more widely. And that's not about excluding. I'm not saying write Shakespeare out of the curriculum, but I think there are tremendously gifted writers who are not Shakespeare and are not, 300-year-old or 500-year-old or 100-year-old or even 50-year-old white men. There are great writers, James Baldwin, there are hundreds, thousands. So how do you want to expand, make the curriculum more inclusive, and not through denigration of our own traditions, but by opening them to challenge from other traditions? And I think that goes, I've mentioned literature, but the same phenomenon takes place in history, political science. I think the harder area, one where frankly we struggle, is figuring out how a more open, inclusive, cross-cultural curriculum plays out in the natural sciences and mathematics, etc. There's some superficial answers to that. Mathematics obviously has great roots in Arab culture, etc. But what does it mean now? And I think that we're really struggling with. But I actually sense across the university much more openness to challenging some of our traditional patterns, asking the kinds of questions that Professor Hewson's asked. And we have various projects at Cambridge undertaking that in history, in the English faculty, in music, and in other areas, political science.
Yeah. I would say, for us as UCT, the recognition that with the marginalization of people, the historical marginalization of people, there has been also the marginalization of not only the intellectual traditions, but also the ways of being, doing, and seeing that come with those people. But what the challenge is, how do you then bring other intellectual traditions? How do you normalize also other ways of being, doing, and seeing? And for me, that's the transformation challenge. Because doing that means, calls on us to call out what is now seen as universal knowledge. Because what's universal knowledge is knowledge only from one part of the world, but it doesn't name itself as Western knowledge. It is seen as just knowledge. So even the way we take on the project of decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing research or anything calls on us to first be humble about what we currently call just knowledge, to say it is not just knowledge, it's Western. It doesn't necessarily mean you throw it out, but you're saying we've got to introduce other knowledge systems into the space. And I have a challenge here, Stephen, with the issue of why do we then name the other knowledge? So when you talk about African knowledge systems, you name it. Of course, naming it makes it visible in terms of introducing it to the space, but also it can serve to marginalize it with time. So when you say this is Eastern knowledge, this is not whatever African, it's nice, and at some stage we're gonna have to call it knowledge, and it's got to interact with other traditions, and also the way we introduce it. I mean, the decolonization project, we have taken on the journey to decolonization. It's not an easy journey because it doesn't mean go back to the past. It means introduce other knowledge systems. And when you do that, To respect it means that you've got to treat it like other knowledges, which means you don't just take it on and just accept it as a rule. If you respect it, you're going to engage with it. Some people will use it as is. Some people will make it interact with other knowledge systems. Some people will disagree with it and engage with it. And even that is important, because just engaging with it and saying, but I agree here, I don't agree there, still means you respecting it, because the worst thing that can happen to any knowledge in our space of ideas is ignoring it and pretending and going on as if it doesn't exist. And so I often say we are open to, we are taking on the decolonization project with that understanding. The respect for the knowledge means that you allow it to grow, and allowing it to grow means it can interact, something new can emerge, you can adopt, internalize, and use as is, or you can engage and disagree and say why you agree with the other stuff and not, and that's what we do with all other knowledges. So it's a good challenge, but it's not just about the intellectual traditions, it's also about ways of being, because that's not spoken about. We cannot expect to introduce other intellectual traditions, but expect the people in the knowledge space to still behave and be like the mainstream or the Western.
Could I just add to that? I absolutely agree with you. And where I have seen that playing out most clearly in my experience is with Indigenous cultures within the Canadian context. When I was at the University of British Columbia, your point is exactly right. Well, 2 points I want to highlight. One is this idea that there are ways of being that have to be allowed in a sense, to the university environment along with the ideas. It's not just written texts and reports of cultures, etc., that come in. It has to be how people actually understand their place in the world, how it is that they interact with other people. I've seen this play out, and it is very difficult in a lot of Western institutions to destabilize the patterns and to challenge those patterns. On the other hand, and I agree with you on this too, I also think it's hugely important to engage and to be part of a process of actual respect, as you put it, modesty and respect for the other, for a different way of thinking, way of being, way of acting. And I think the worst thing that can happen is bringing in different, quotes, knowledge systems, but then treating them as kind of museum pieces off on the edge. So yes, we've got a bunch of courses that talk about African philosophy or whatever, as if that is different from philosophy, and that has to be really engaged with, and it's very tough. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I like what you said in your talk about the need for institutions to listen to the needs of our world. And I think it touches on this, even this challenge of diversifying knowledge systems in our environments. But how can universities become better listeners? I mean, at one level we say, listen, but we are the thought leaders, so we come with, so how can we become better leaders? I mean, aren't we, I often say to my children that, the academic profession is very interesting. It's the knowledge profession. In the midst of many things that it teaches you arrogance. In a subtle way, because you learn to defend your ideas. You learn to hold your ground, and you learn to do all sorts of sophisticated ways of telling people you don't agree with them and you don't think what they're saying is worth saying. But it's a training in arrogance. How do we listen when part of what we're doing is this, we are a place of ideas, we are the thought leaders, so we contribute. But your idea of, and it comes with servant leadership, listen to the world, because that's the best way to serve the world. You can't serve what you don't know, and you can't know if you don't listen.
I think this is maybe the hardest thing for universities. I like to say that universities, and frankly, all of us, many colleagues, are great to be on projection mode. telling people how to behave, sharing knowledge, as we like to say, communicating knowledge. There is a certain arrogance in it, but it's inbuilt in our traditions, and so I'm not blaming people for it. I actually think we self-select for it, we train for it, as you've suggested. So I think we have to actually undermine that a little bit. And one of the ways that I've thought about this is whether or not we can learn more generally from people who do community-based research. There are, and I know at UCT, scores and scores, hundreds probably, of colleagues doing community-based research. They have to be in a position to listen to what the community is saying if they're going to be successful, I would think. And I've seen this again with Indigenous communities, with communities that are poorer, et cetera, et cetera. I think if we could try to capture some of what it is that we learn in our community-based research and try to share it more generally across the university and reflect on it, that's what we do. Reflexivity here is really important. Reflect on it and try to figure out what it means for our broader endeavor. I think that's one practical way we could help ourselves.
There's another question here, Stephen, that came through from Professor Chris Jacobs. And Professor Chris Jacobs is concerned that we're not talking about the future of universities. And he says in 10 years, he envisages that, he says, are we not afraid that private universities in the next 10 years are going to push us out of the higher education market? He thinks they'll be, but by the way, Stephen, I don't think the threat is just, I mean, people are worried about private universities. I think corporates, as I mentioned earlier, Google has just shown an example. Are you concerned about the future of universities, particularly universities that are seen like Cambridge and UCT, that are top performing universities? Is there a danger that we rest in our success and we become irrelevant?
Yes, there is such a danger, but you know, I actually have confidence that that won't happen. Yeah. And a couple of points. The first is, there is a reason that universities have sustained as an institutional structure for hundreds of years. You know, my institution is more than 800 years old, but it's not the same institution as it was 100 years ago. It's not even the same institution as it was 50 years ago. There are certain patterns and there's certain traditions that still play out, but there is also an enormous ability to flex, to change, interestingly. We don't often think of universities as being places of change, but I think if you look historically over time, they are places of dramatic change. And I think we will adapt. I think we have to adapt. I think you're absolutely right. One of the great challenges will be independent corporations running programs that are targeted only on job market issues. And one of the things that we have to think about is how to connect what we do, which is not just about training people for their first job or their next job, but actually helping them construct a life in many ways. And how do we do that in an era where there will be more challenges, a lot of online challenges, for example? There's no doubt, I think we've all learned from COVID that we can do things online that we never imagined we would do or should do. I can sense around Cambridge dramatic change just over the last 3 months. I don't think we are going to go back to the way we were before. I think there will be massive changes that take place in the provision of blended learning, in opportunities for so-called lifelong learning, working with alumni, helping them to transition in their careers. There are just enormous opportunities for universities here, but if we don't seize those opportunities, others will. So I remain positive that the university of the future won't look exactly the same, but will still exist.
I can see that we don't have much time. This has been a very, very interesting conversation, and I've got so many questions, and I'm wondering what is the one question that I should ask you that we can end with. I mean, there's a lot of experience from COVID, and you talked about global leaders, global partnership, and I'm wondering what are you going to do different in terms of partnerships, particularly with countries such as continents such as Africa? Is there going to be a marked difference in terms of partnerships as a result of the experience that you had with COVID?
It's a really tough question, and the truth is, I think we're just beginning to figure that out. I don't have a good answer, but I would say that certain opportunities are revealing themselves. I mean, we were talking before about the idea that we could create more classrooms on these shared platforms where people from UCT and Cambridge students could actually be on the platform together. We've discovered that we can deliver this kind of programming, we can deliver teaching online in a more fluid way than I think we might have imagined. And that should open up opportunities for us. I think, you know, there will also be real challenges. We're not probably going to have as much flying around the world, and that is probably a good thing from the perspective of climate, etc., until we get to decarbonized air travel, which is something we're working on at Cambridge. But I think that means that we're going to have to be more intentional about creating online opportunities that are rich and truly interactive, not just the sort of thing that we've had, which is a couple of us talking, but how do we build platforms where there's more engagement with a somewhat wider group? And I think we just have to strategize about that, and we have to do it quickly. So I would say both on the research and the teaching side, there are real opportunities that have come out of this. And we should seize them as quickly as possible, even if it's in the early days, it's just pilot projects to get going, to build confidence about how we can collaborate more effectively.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Toope, for a very enlightening, inspiring, and engaging conversation this afternoon. And thank you to everyone who attended and shared Professor Toope's insights. Professor Toope, we thank you especially for your concern for the society we live in. You know, here in South Africa or anywhere on the continent, it is easy to think that our problems are far removed from the rest of the world. You have reminded us that we are truly connected in more ways than we may realize. And it is heartening to know that a university as prestigious as Cambridge wrestles with many of the same questions as institutions in South Africa. I look forward to seeing how we can continue to partner with you to benefit our respective societies and the wider world. Friends, colleagues, this concludes the VC's open lecture for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good evening.